Beasts, Men and Gods, by Ferdinand Ossendowski. Part 1. Drawing Lots with Death. Chapter 1. Into the Forests. In the early months of the year 1920 I chanced to be residing in the Siberian town of Krasnoyarsk, situated upon the shores of the river Yenisei, that noble stream which is cradled within the sun-bathed mountains of Mongolia to pour its warming vitality into the Arctic Ocean, and to whose mouth Nansen has twice journeyed to open the briefest commercial route from Europe to the heart of Asia. There, in the depths of the profound Siberian winter, I was suddenly swept up in the tempestuous maelstrom of the frantic revolution then ravaging the entirety of Russia, disseminating in this erstwhile peaceful and prosperous land vengeance, hatred, bloodshed, and transgressions that go unpunished by the law. No man could foretell the hour of his doom. The populace existed from one day to the next and departed their residences in ignorance of whether they would ever return to them or whether they would be violently abducted from the thoroughfares and cast into the dungeons of that mockery of justice, the Revolutionary Committee, more dreadful and sanguinary than those of the medieval Inquisition. We who were foreigners in this distraught nation were not spared its persecutions, and I personally endured their severities. One morning, when I had ventured out to visit an acquaintance, I was suddenly apprised that 20 red soldiers had encircled my residence to apprehend me, and that I must abscond immediately. I hastily donned one of my friend's old hunting suits, secured a sum of currency, and hurried away on foot through the town's clandestine alleys until I reached the open thoroughfare, where I engaged a peasant, who within 4 hours had conveyed me a distance of 20 miles from the town and deposited me in the midst of a densely forested expanse. En route I procured a rifle, 300 cartridges, an axe, a knife, a sheepskin overcoat, tea, salt, dried bread, and a kettle. I ventured into the heart of the woodland to an abandoned, partially scorched hut. From that day forth I assumed the vocation of a bona fide trapper, but I never envisioned maintaining this guise for as long as I ultimately did. The following morning I went hunting and had the fortuitous success of felling 2 heathcock. I observed an abundance of deer tracks and felt assured that I would not suffer from a scarcity of sustenance. However, my sojourn in this refuge was not destined to be prolonged. 5 days later, when I returned from the hunt, I discerned smoke curling upward from the chimney of my dwelling. I stealthily crept closer to the cabin and discovered a pair of saddled horses with military rifles slung to their saddles. 2 disarmed men posed little peril to an armed individual such as myself, so I swiftly rushed across the clearing and entered the hut. From the bench 2 soldiers sprang to their feet in alarm. They were Bolsheviki. Upon their voluminous astrakhan caps I distinguished the red stars of Bolshevism, and upon their tunics the soiled crimson bands. We exchanged greetings and seated ourselves. The soldiers had already prepared tea, and so we partook of this perpetually welcome hot beverage and conversed, eyeing one another with mutual suspicion the while. In an effort to allay this suspicion on their part, I informed them that I was a hunter hailing from a distant locale and was residing there because I found it to be excellent territory for sables. They announced to me that they were soldiers of a detachment dispatched from a nearby town into the woods to pursue all suspicious individuals. "Do you understand, comrade?" said one of them to me. "We are searching for counter-revolutionists to execute them?" I was acutely aware of this fact without his clarification. All my efforts were concentrated upon persuading them by my demeanor that I was merely an unassuming peasant hunter, and that I shared nothing in common with the counter-revolutionists. I was thinking also all the time of where I should go after the departure of my unwelcome guests. It grew dark. In the encroaching obscurity their countenances appeared even less agreeable. They produced bottles of vodka and drank, and the intoxicating effects of the alcohol soon became conspicuously apparent. They conversed vociferously and incessantly interrupted one another, boasting how many bourgeoisie they had slaughtered in Krasnoyarsk and how many Cossacks they had shoved beneath the ice of the river. Afterwards they began to quarrel, but soon they were fatigued and prepared to slumber. All of a sudden, and without any preamble, the door of the hut swung wide open, and the steam of the heated room billowed outward in a voluminous cloud, out of which seemed to rise like a genie, as the vapor settled, the figure of a tall, gaunt peasant impressively crowned with the high astrakhan cap and enveloped in the massive sheepskin overcoat that amplified his imposing stature. He stood with his rifle poised to fire. Tucked beneath his girdle lay the sharp axe without which the Siberian peasant cannot endure. Eyes, alert and gleaming like those of a wild beast, fixed themselves alternately on each of us. In a moment he removed his cap, traced the sign of the cross upon his breast, and inquired of us, "Who is the master here?" I answered him, "May I lodge here for the night?" "Yes," I replied, "ample space for all." "Have a cup of tea. It remains hot." The stranger, his gaze roving unceasingly over each of us and over every detail of the room, began to remove his sheepskin coat after depositing his rifle in the corner. He was attired in an aged leather tunic with trousers of the same material tucked in tall felt boots. His countenance was quite youthful, refined and tinged with an expression akin to mockery. His sharp, white teeth gleamed as his penetrating eyes scrutinized everything they rested upon. I observed the strands of gray in his shaggy hair. Deep lines of bitterness framed his mouth. They indicated his life had been exceptionally tempestuous and fraught with peril. He assumed a seat beside his rifle and placed his axe on the floorboards below. "What, is that your wife?" inquired one of the inebriated soldiers, gesturing toward the axe. The tall peasant regarded him placidly from the quiet eyes under their heavy brows and as calmly answered, "One encounters a varied sort of folk these days, and with an axe it is considerably safer." He commenced drinking tea with marked voracity, while his eyes darted toward me many times with sharp inquiry in them, and scoured often the entirety of the cabin in search of the answer to his unspoken doubts. Very slowly and with a guarded drawl he answered all the soldiers' interrogations between swallows of the scalding beverage. Then he inverted his glass to signify that he had finished, rested on the top of it the remaining morsel of sugar, and remarked to the soldiers, "I am going out to tend to my horse, and shall unsaddle your mounts for you as well." "Very well," exclaimed the half-slumbering young soldier. "Bring in our rifles as well." The soldiers were reclining on the benches, and thus left for us only the floor. The stranger soon returned, conveyed the rifles, and situated them in the darkened corner. He dropped the saddle pads on the floorboards, seated himself on them, and began to remove his boots. The soldiers and my newly arrived guest were soon snoring, but I did not slumber for contemplating my subsequent course of action. Ultimately, as dawn was breaking, I drifted into a light slumber only to awaken in broad daylight and discover my stranger gone. I ventured outside the hut and found him saddling a magnificent bay stallion. "Are you departing?" I inquired. "Yes, but I wish to travel alongside these comrades," he whispered, "and afterward I shall return." I pressed him no further and informed him only that I would await his return. He detached the saddlebags that had been suspended from his mount, stowed them out of sight in the scorched corner of the cabin, inspected the stirrups and bridle, and, as he concluded the saddling process, offered a smile and stated, "I am ready. I am going to awaken my comrades." Half an hour following their morning draught of tea, my 3 guests took their leave. I remained out of doors and was occupied with splitting firewood for my stove. Suddenly, from a distance, rifle shots rang out through the forest, first a single report, then a second. Thereafter all was completely still. From the vicinity of the gunfire, a frightened covey of blackcock broke cover and flew overhead. At the summit of a towering pine, a jay cried out. I listened intently for a prolonged duration to ascertain whether anyone was approaching my hut, but everything remained entirely tranquil. Along the lower Yenisei it grows dark exceedingly early. I kindled a fire in my stove and began to prepare my soup, perpetually straining my ears for every sound that might emanate from beyond the cabin walls. Undoubtedly, I maintained a profound clarity at all times that death remained my constant companion, poised to claim me by means of either man, beast, cold, accident, or disease. I was acutely aware that no one was near to offer assistance and that my salvation lay entirely in the hands of God, in the strength of my own limbs, in the precision of my aim, and in my presence of mind. Nevertheless, I listened in vain. I had failed to perceive the return of my stranger. Just as on the previous day, he materialized abruptly upon the threshold. Through the billowing steam, I discerned his mirthful eyes and handsome countenance. He strode into the hut and, with a considerable clatter, deposited 3 rifles into the corner. 2 horses, 2 rifles, 2 saddles, 2 boxes of dry bread, half a brick of tea, a small bag of salt, 50 cartridges, 2 overcoats, 2 pairs of boots, he enumerated with a laugh. In truth, I enjoyed a highly successful hunt today. I gazed at him in sheer astonishment. At what are you surprised? He laughed. Who has need of those comrades? Who could possibly have any use for such fellows? Let us partake of our tea and retire for the night. Tomorrow, I shall guide you to another, more secure location before proceeding on my way. Chapter 2. The Secret of My Fellow Traveler. At the break of dawn, we set forth, departing from my initial place of refuge. We stowed our personal effects into the bags and secured them upon one of the saddles. We must traverse 400 or 500 versts, calmly announced my fellow traveler, who called himself Ivan, a name that resonated neither in my mind nor my heart in a land where every second man bore the same moniker. We shall be traveling for a considerable duration. Then, I remarked with a measure of regret. No more than 1 week, perhaps even less, he replied. We passed that night in the forest, sheltered beneath the expansive, spreading branches of the fir trees. It was my maiden night in the woodland beneath the open sky. How many such nights I was destined to endure throughout the 1.5 years of my wanderings. Throughout the day, the cold was intensely bitter. The frozen snow crunched beneath the hooves of the horses, and the icy clusters that formed and broke away from them rolled across the crust with a sound akin to crackling glass. The heathcock took flight from the trees with profound indolence. Hares loped unhurriedly along the dry beds of summer streams. As night fell, the wind began to sigh and whistle, bowing the treetops high above our heads, while below, it remained entirely still and calm. We halted within a deep ravine bordered by massive trees, where we located fallen firs, hewed them into logs for the fire, and, having boiled our tea, partook of our dinner. Ivan hauled in 2 tree trunks, squared them on a single side with his axe, laid one atop the other with their squared faces aligned, and subsequently drove a substantial wedge into the butt ends, separating them by 3 or 4 inches. We then introduced live coals into this opening and observed the fire advance rapidly along the entire length of the faces positioned face to face. "Now there will be a fire in the morning," he announced. "This is the Nida of the gold prospectors. We prospectors, wandering the forests through summer and winter, always sleep beside this Nida. Splendid. You shall see for yourself," he continued. He severed fir branches to construct a sloping roof, resting it upon 2 uprights angled toward the Nida. Above our shelter of boughs and our Nida, the overarching branches of the protective fir spread wide. Additional branches were gathered and strewn over the snow beneath the roof. Upon these, the saddle cloths were arranged, collectively forming a seat where Ivan could recline and strip off his outer garments down to his blouse. Presently, I observed that his forehead was slick with perspiration, and that he was wiping both it and his neck upon his sleeves. "Now it is pleasantly warm," he exclaimed. Before long, I too was compelled to discard my overcoat, and I soon lay down to sleep devoid of any covering whatsoever. Meanwhile, through the branches of the fir trees and our makeshift roof glimmered the cold, brilliant stars, and just beyond the Nida raged a biting frost, from which we remained cozily shielded. Following that night, I was no longer intimidated by the cold. Though chilled to the bone during the days spent on horseback, I found myself thoroughly warmed by the genial Nida at night, and I rested unburdened from my heavy overcoat, sitting clad merely in my blouse beneath the roofs of pine and fir, sipping the perpetually welcome tea. Over the course of our daily treks, Ivan recounted the tales of his extensive wanderings through the mountains and forests of Transbaikalia in pursuit of gold. These narratives were immensely spirited, brimming with compelling adventure, perilous encounters, and arduous struggles. Ivan epitomized the sort of prospector who has unearthed the richest of gold mines in Russia, and perhaps in other nations, while they themselves invariably remain paupers. He circumvented explaining his reasons for departing Transbaikalia to venture toward the Yenisei. Discerning from his demeanor that he preferred to keep his own counsel, I refrained from pressing the matter. However, the veil of secrecy shrouding this segment of his mysterious existence was one day serendipitously lifted a fraction. We had already arrived at the objective point of our journey. Throughout the entire day, we had labored with difficulty through dense thickets of willow, steadily approaching the shores of the Mana, the formidable right branch of the Yenisei. Everywhere about us lay narrow trails, packed firmly by the tread of the hares that inhabited this brush. These small, white denizens of the woodland darted ceaselessly to and fro before our path. On another occasion, we caught sight of a fox's red tail as the creature secreted itself behind a rock, simultaneously observing both us and the unsuspecting hares. Ivan had maintained his silence for a considerable duration. Eventually, he spoke up, informing me that a short distance away lay a small tributary of the Mana, at the mouth of which stood a solitary hut. "What do you say? Shall we press on toward it, or pass the night beside the Nida?" I proposed proceeding to the cabin, as I harbored a desire to wash and felt it would be highly agreeable to pass the night beneath a genuine roof once more. Ivan knit his brows in deliberation, but acceded. Dusk was gathering as we neared a hut enveloped by the dense forest and unkempt thickets of wild raspberry. The structure comprised a single, diminutive room with 2 microscopic windows and a monumental Russian stove. Leaning against the edifice were the decaying remnants of a shed and a cellar. We stoked the stove and set about preparing our modest dinner. Ivan partook of the liquor from the bottle inherited from the soldiers, and before long he grew markedly eloquent, with eyes that shone with a feverish brilliance and hands that coursed frequently and rapidly through his long locks. He commenced the recitation of one of his past adventures, but halted abruptly and, with palpable dread in his eyes, squinted into a shadowy corner. "Is that a rat?" he inquired. "I do not see anything," I replied. He lapsed into silence once more, reflecting with a furrowed brow. We frequently remained silent for hours at a stretch, and, consequently, I was not particularly astonished. Ivan leaned in closely and began to speak in a hushed whisper. "I wish to recount an old story to you. I possessed a friend in Transbaikalia. He was a banished convict. His name was Gavrinsky. Through innumerable forests and across myriad mountains we journeyed in search of gold, and we held a solemn agreement to divide all that we acquired into equal shares. But Gavrinsky precipitously ventured out into the taiga, along the Yenisei, and subsequently disappeared. After 5 years we heard that he had discovered an exceedingly rich gold mine and had amassed great wealth. Then later that both he and his wife had been murdered. Ivan remained perfectly still for a moment before continuing. "This is their former hut. He resided here with his wife, and somewhere along this very river he extracted his gold. Yet he divulged its location to no one. All the local peasants are aware that he held a substantial fortune in the bank, and that he had been selling gold to the government. It was here that they were murdered." Ivan stepped toward the stove, withdrew a flaming brand, and, bending low, illuminated a particular spot upon the floor. "Do you observe these stains upon the floor and on the wall? It is their blood, the blood of Gavrinsky. They perished, but they steadfastly refused to disclose the whereabouts of the gold. It was excavated from a deep shaft which they had driven into the riverbank, and was subsequently concealed within the cellar beneath the shed. But Gavrinsky betrayed nothing. And Lord, how I tortured them! I burned them with fire. I bent back their fingers. I gouged out their eyes. Yet Gavrinsky died in absolute silence." He pondered for a moment, then quickly said to me, "I have heard all this from the peasants." He cast the log into the stove and sank heavily onto the bench. "It is time to sleep," he declared abruptly, and grew still. For a considerable time, I listened to his breathing and to the muted murmurs he directed at himself, as he shifted from side to side and smoked his pipe. In the morning, we departed from this scene of immense suffering and crime, and on the 7th day of our journey, we arrived at a dense cedar forest situated on the foothills of a sprawling mountain range. From here, Ivan explained to me, it is 80 versts to the nearest peasant settlement. The locals venture into these woods to harvest cedar nuts, but exclusively in the autumn. Prior to that season, you shall encounter no one. Furthermore, you will discover an abundance of birds and beasts, along with a plentiful supply of nuts, which will render it possible for you to survive here. Do you see this river? When you wish to locate the peasants, follow the course of this stream, and it will guide you to them. Ivan assisted me in constructing my earthen shelter. However, it was not a conventional mud hut. Rather, it was formed by the uprooted base of a colossal cedar, likely felled during a tempestuous storm, which provided a deep cavity that served as the primary chamber of my dwelling. This space was flanked on one side by a wall of earth, held firmly in place by the upturned roots. The overhanging roots simultaneously formed a framework into which we interlaced poles and branches to construct a roof, which we then fortified with stones for stability and packed with snow for insulation. The entrance of the shelter remained perpetually open, yet it was constantly safeguarded by the vigilant Nida. Within that snow-clad den, I spent 2 months that passed like summer, encountering no other human beings and devoid of any contact with the outside world, where such momentous events were presently unfolding. In that sepulchre beneath the roots of the fallen tree, I existed before the face of nature. My trials and my profound anxiety concerning my family served as my constant companions amid a rigorous struggle for survival. Ivan departed on the second day, leaving behind only a sack of dry bread and a meager ration of sugar. I never saw him again. Chapter 3. The Struggle for Life. Then I was entirely alone. Surrounding me was nothing but the forest of perpetually green cedars blanketed in snow, the barren bushes, the frozen river, and, as far as my eyes could peer through the branches and tree trunks, a vast ocean of cedars and snow. The Siberian taiga. How long should I be compelled to reside in this desolation? Would the Bolsheviki discover my whereabouts? Would my friends ever learn of my location? What fate was befalling my family? These inquiries raged like unquenchable fires within my mind. Soon I comprehended why Ivan had guided me for such a great distance. We had bypassed numerous secluded locations during our journey, places entirely devoid of human presence where Ivan might have safely deposited me. Yet he had consistently maintained that he would lead me to a refuge where survival would prove less arduous. And indeed, his words held true. The allure of my solitary refuge lay in the cedar woods and the forest-draped mountains that extended to every horizon. The cedar is a magnificent, formidable tree with expansive branches that form an evergreen canopy, drawing every living creature to its shelter. Amidst the cedars, there existed a perpetual, effervescent vitality. There, the squirrels were ceaselessly engaged in a lively commotion, bounding from tree to tree. The nutcrackers issued shrill cries. A flock of bullfinches, bearing carmine breasts, swept through the timber like a sudden flame, or a small legion of goldfinches would descend, filling the arboreal amphitheater with their melodious whistling. A hare would dart swiftly from one trunk to another, while behind it crept the barely perceptible shadow of a white ermine gliding across the snow. And for a considerable time, I would watch the solitary black speck that I knew to be the tip of its tail. Cautiously treading upon the hard-crusted snow, a noble deer would approach, and finally, descending from the mountain's summit, the sovereign of the Siberian forest, the brown bear, would pay me a visit. All of this diverted my attention and dispelled the bleak thoughts from my mind, encouraging me to persevere. It was equally beneficial, albeit physically demanding, to ascend to the pinnacle of my mountain, which rose prominently above the forest and from which I could gaze across the expanse toward the Crimson Range on the horizon. This was the red cliff situated on the further bank of the Yenisei. There lay the inhabited country, the towns, both adversaries and allies. And there, too, was the specific point I identified as the dwelling place of my family. This was precisely the reason Ivan had guided me to this vantage. And as the days of this solitude slipped by, I began to sorely miss this companion who, despite being the murderer of Gavrinsky, had tended to me with the devotion of a father, consistently saddling my horse, chopping firewood, and doing his utmost to ensure my comfort. He had endured many winters entirely alone with nothing but his own thoughts, standing face to face with nature, or rather, I should say, before the face of God. He had tasted the profound horrors of solitude and had acquired a remarkable facility for enduring them. I sometimes resolved that, should I be destined to meet my end in this desolate place, I would expend my final reserves of strength to drag myself to the mountain's summit, choosing to die there while gazing across the infinite sea of peaks and forests toward the very spot where my loved ones resided. Nevertheless, this existence provided me with ample material for reflection, and even more demanding occupation for my physical faculties. It was a continuous struggle for survival, unrelenting and severe. The most arduous labor lay in the preparation of massive logs for the naida. The fallen tree trunks were heavily blanketed in snow and frozen solidly to the earth. I was compelled to excavate them and subsequently, utilizing a long branch as a lever, dislodge them from their resting places. To facilitate this endeavor, I selected the mountain slope as the source of my supplies. Though the ascent was strenuous, it allowed me to easily roll the timber downward. Soon thereafter, I made a magnificent discovery. I located near my den a substantial quantity of larch, that beautiful yet melancholic giant of the forest, which had been felled during a massive tempest. The trunks were shrouded in snow but remained tethered to the stumps from which they had been fractured. Upon striking these stumps with my axe, the blade buried itself so deeply that it could be extracted only with considerable effort. Investigating the cause, I found the wood to be heavily saturated with pitch. Splinters from this timber required a mere spark to ignite into flame, and from that moment onward, I perpetually maintained a stockpile of them. They served to swiftly kindle a fire, allowing me to warm my hands upon returning from the hunt or to rapidly boil water for my tea. The greater portion of my days was occupied by the hunt. I came to realize that I must diligently distribute my labors across each day, as the exertion distracted me from my sorrowful and oppressive thoughts. Generally, following my morning tea, I ventured into the forest in pursuit of heathcock or blackcock. Upon securing one or two of the birds, I would commence the preparation of my dinner, which never boasted an extensive menu. It consisted invariably of game soup accompanied by a handful of dried bread, followed by endless cups of tea, the quintessential beverage of the wilderness. Once, while scouring the forest for birds, I detected a rustling within the dense shrubbery, and peering cautiously about, I discerned the tips of a deer's antlers. I crawled stealthily toward the location, but the vigilant beast perceived my approach. With a tremendous clamor, it burst from the underbrush, and I observed it quite clearly as it halted upon the mountain slope after sprinting perhaps 300 paces. It was a magnificent creature, bearing a dark gray coat and a nearly black spine, and standing as large as a small cow. I rested my rifle across a branch and discharged my weapon. The animal executed a massive leap, dashed a few strides, and collapsed. I sprinted toward the beast with all my might, but it rose once more, half jumping and half dragging itself further up the incline. A second shot successfully halted its flight. I had thus secured a warm carpet for my den and an abundant reserve of meat. I fastened the antlers among the branches of my wall, where they functioned as an excellent rack for my hat. I cannot forget one remarkably captivating yet entirely wild scene that unfolded before me several kilometers from my den. There existed a diminutive swamp, carpeted with grass and interspersed with cranberries, where blackcock and sand partridges customarily gathered to feed upon the fruit. I approached noiselessly from behind the brush and beheld an entire flock of blackcock, scratching at the snow and plucking out the berries. As I surveyed this scene, one of the blackcock abruptly sprang upward, prompting the remainder of the startled flock to take swift flight. To my profound astonishment, the initial bird ascended vertically in a spiraling trajectory, only to plummet earthward entirely lifeless. Upon my approach, a rapacious ermine darted from the carcass of the slain fowl and sought refuge beneath the trunk of a fallen tree. The bird's neck had been severely lacerated. I subsequently deduced that the ermine had assaulted the blackcock, anchoring itself to the bird's neck. It was thereby borne aloft as it extracted the blood from its victim's throat, ultimately precipitating the heavy fall back to the earth. Owing to this predator's aeronautic exploit, I was spared the expenditure of a single cartridge. Thus I existed, incessantly battling for the morrow while becoming increasingly consumed by severe and bitter reflections. As the days and weeks elapsed, I soon perceived the gentle breath of warmer winds. Across the open expanses, the snow commenced its thaw, and in scattered locales, diminutive rivulets of water began to manifest. On another occasion, I observed a fly or a spider stirring to life after the harsh winter. Spring was swiftly approaching. I grew acutely aware that, during the vernal season, departing the forest would prove an impossibility. Every river surged beyond its banks, the marshlands became utterly impassable, and all the customary animal trails were transformed into channels for rushing streams. I recognized that I was condemned to endure the continuation of my solitude until the advent of summer. Spring swiftly asserted its dominion, and before long, my mountain was liberated from its snowy mantle, exposing only stones, the trunks of birch and aspen trees, and the towering cones of anthills. In various stretches, the river shattered its icy carapace, coursing forcefully with abundant foam and bubbles. Chapter 4. The Fisherman. One day while engaged in the hunt, I approached the riverbank and observed numerous exceedingly large fish possessing crimson backs, appearing as though they were suffused with blood. They navigated the surface, basking in the sun's rays. Once the river was entirely devoid of ice, these fish materialized in tremendous multitudes. I presently apprehended that they were traversing upstream toward the minor tributaries for the spawning season. I resolved to employ a predatory method of angling, one universally prohibited by the statutes of all civilized nations. Yet, jurists and legislators alike ought to extend leniency toward a man residing in a burrow beneath the roots of a fallen tree, who dares to transgress their rational laws. Assembling a multitude of slender birch and aspen saplings, I constructed a weir within the stream bed that the fish were incapable of bypassing. Shortly thereafter, I observed them attempting to leap over the barrier. Near the bank, I engineered a breach in my barricade roughly 18 inches beneath the water's surface, and to the upstream side, I affixed a tall basket woven from pliant willow twigs, into which the fish swam as they navigated the opening. I then stood ruthlessly by, dispatching them with resolute blows to the head using a stout cudgel. The entirety of my catch exceeded 30 pounds apiece, with certain specimens surpassing 80. This particular variety, known as the taimen, belongs to the trout family and constitutes the finest fare within the Yenisei. After a fortnight, the migration concluded, and my basket yielded no further treasures. Consequently, I recommenced my hunting endeavors. Chapter 5. a dangerous neighbor. The hunt grew increasingly profitable and enjoyable, as the advent of spring animated the entirety of the wilderness. In the morning, at the break of day, the forest abounded with voices, calls that would prove strange and indiscernible to a dweller of the city. High upon the cedar's uppermost branches, the heathcock clucked and crooned his amorous song, gazing admiringly at the gray hen as she scratched among the fallen foliage below. It was exceedingly simple to approach this fully plumed Caruso and, with a single shot, bring him down from his poetic romanticism to fulfill a more utilitarian purpose. His demise constituted a merciful passing, for he was deeply in love and perceived absolutely nothing. Out in the clearing, the blackcocks, exhibiting their broadly fanned, spotted tails, engaged in fierce combat, while the hens strutted nearby, craning their necks and chattering, likely exchanging gossip regarding their dueling suitors. They watched the spectacle with evident delight. From the distance emanated the stern and resonant roar of the deer's mating call, imbued nonetheless with tenderness and affection. Meanwhile, from the crags above descended the abrupt, staccato barks of the mountain buck. Hares frolicked among the shrubbery, and frequently, a red fox lay flattened against the earth in close proximity, acutely biding its time. I never once heard the howl of a wolf. Indeed, they are seldom encountered within the densely forested and mountainous regions of Siberia. However, I harbored another formidable beast as my neighbor, and circumstances dictated that one of us would have to depart. One afternoon, returning from the hunt bearing a sizable heathcock, I abruptly discerned a dark, undulating mass amidst the trees. Halting my advance and observing with the utmost scrutiny, I identified a bear vigorously excavating an anthill. Upon catching my scent, the beast snorted violently and shuffled away with remarkable alacrity, astonishing me with the sheer velocity of his otherwise lumbering gait. The subsequent morning, while I still lay huddled beneath my overcoat, a disturbance to the rear of my den arrested my attention. Peering out with deliberate caution, I discovered the bear. He stood upon his hind legs, sniffing vociferously, evidently intent upon investigating precisely what living creature had appropriated the ursine custom of wintering beneath the trunks of fallen trees. I loosed a sharp shout and struck my kettle resonantly with the axe. My early visitor retreated with maximal vigor. Nevertheless, his intrusion afforded me no pleasure whatsoever. This incident occurred exceptionally early in the spring, a period when the bear ought not yet to have forsaken his hibernating quarters. He was what is colloquially termed an anteater, an aberrant breed of bear, wholly devoid of the refined etiquette characteristic of the premier families of the Ursine clan. Aware that these anteaters are notoriously irritable and audacious, I swiftly commenced preparations for both defense and a potential offensive charge. My preparations were brief. I filed down the tips of 5 of my cartridges, thereby fashioning expanding projectiles, an exceedingly persuasive argument against such an unwelcome guest. Donning my coat, I proceeded to the location where I had initially encountered the beast, an area densely populated with anthills. I executed a thorough sweep of the entire mountain and inspected every ravine, yet my caller was nowhere to be found. Fatigued and profoundly disappointed, I was approaching my shelter in a rather unguarded state, when I abruptly discovered the sovereign of the forest himself emerging from my humble dwelling, actively sniffing the perimeter of its entrance. I discharged my weapon, The projectile pierced his flank. Roaring with a tempestuous blend of agony and fury, he reared upward onto his hind legs. As my second shot shattered one of his supporting limbs, he collapsed into a squat. However, dragging the fractured leg and valiantly endeavoring to remain upright, he lunged forward to assail me. It required a third bullet directly to the breast to finally arrest his advance. He weighed, by my closest estimation, between 200 and 250 pounds, and provided remarkably delectable sustenance. His meat was exceptionally exquisite when fashioned into cutlets, and only marginally less magnificent when formed into minced steaks, which I molded and roasted upon heated stones. I observed them swell into substantial spheres, rendering them as delightfully airy as the finest fluffy omelets we once patronized at the restaurant The Bear in Petrograd. I subsisted upon this most welcome augmentation to my larder until the earth had sufficiently dried and the stream's current had abated enough to permit my travel downriver, bound for the territory to which Ivan had directed me. Advancing continuously with the utmost precaution, I undertook the journey along the river on foot. I transported the entirety of my domestic furnishings and worldly goods from my winter quarters, enveloping them within a deerskin sack that I had fashioned by clumsily knotting the hide's legs together. Thus encumbered, I forded the minor streams and waded through the treacherous swamps that obstructed my path. Following 50-odd miles of such arduous traversal, I arrived in the region known as Sivkova, where I discovered the cabin of a peasant named Tropov, situated on the immediate fringes of the forest that had become my natural environment. With him, I took up residence for a time. Now, enveloped in these previously unimaginable surroundings of safety and tranquility, and synthesizing the totality of my experiences within the Siberian taiga, I arrive at the following deductions. Within every spiritually sound individual of our modern era, circumstances of dire necessity inevitably resurrect the dormant traits of primitive man, those of the hunter and the warrior, thereby aiding him profoundly in his perpetual struggle against the forces of nature. Such is the prerogative of the man possessing a cultivated mind and spirit over the untrained individual, who lacks the requisite knowledge and resolve to endure. However, the toll exacted from the cultivated man is that, for him, nothing is more dreadful than absolute solitude and the acute awareness of complete isolation from human society and the realm of moral and aesthetic culture. A single misstep, a solitary moment of frailty, and dark madness will seize a man, propelling him toward inevitable destruction. I endured dreadful days battling cold and hunger, yet I passed even more harrowing days engaged in a struggle of the will to vanquish debilitating, destructive thoughts. The memories of those days chill my heart and mind. Even now, as I vividly resurrect them by recording my experiences, they plunge me back into a state of intense fear and apprehension. Furthermore, I am compelled to observe that individuals in highly civilized states accord excessively little regard to the training that serves man in primitive conditions, circumstances inherent in the struggle against nature for survival. This constitutes the sole natural method for cultivating a new generation of robust, healthy, and indomitable men who simultaneously possess sensitive souls. Nature destroys the weak yet assists the strong, awakening within the soul emotions that remain dormant under the urban conditions of modern existence. Chapter 6. A River in Travail. My presence in the Sivkova region was brief, yet I utilized it to its fullest measure. First, I dispatched a man in whom I placed complete confidence, and whom I deemed entirely trustworthy, to my friends in the town I had recently vacated. From them I received linen, boots, currency, a small case of first aid supplies, and essential medicines. Most importantly, I acquired a passport bearing an assumed name, as I was officially deceased to the Bolsheviki. Secondly, under these comparatively favorable conditions, I deliberated upon the strategy for my future endeavors. Presently, word reached the inhabitants of Sivkova that the Bolshevik commissar would soon arrive to requisition cattle for the Red Army. It was perilous to remain any longer. I waited only until the Yenisei River shed its massive lock of ice, which had kept the waterway sealed long after the smaller rivulets had thawed and the trees had donned their spring foliage. For the sum of 1,000 rubles, I engaged a fisherman who agreed to transport me 55 miles upriver to an abandoned gold mine, contingent upon the river, which had thus far only opened in isolated patches, becoming entirely clear of ice. At last, one morning, I heard a deafening roar akin to a tremendous cannonade. I rushed outside to discover that the river had heaved its enormous bulk of ice and subsequently given way to shatter it. I hastened down to the embankment, where I witnessed an awe-inspiring yet magnificent spectacle. The river had brought down the vast volume of ice dislodged in the south, carrying it northward beneath the thick layer that still obscured parts of the stream, until its sheer weight ultimately breached the northern winter dam, releasing the entire grand mass in one final surge toward the Arctic. The Yenisei, Father Yenisei, Hero Yenisei, is one of the longest rivers in Asia, deep and magnificent, particularly throughout the middle reaches of its course, where it is flanked and confined within canyon-like walls by great, towering mountain ranges. The immense waterway had brought down vast miles of ice fields, fracturing them upon the rapids and isolated rocks, twisting them into furious vortexes and upheaving sections of the black winter roads. Furthermore, it swept away the teepees erected for the convenience of passing caravans, which customarily travel from Minusинsk to Krasnoyarsk over the frozen river during the winter months. Periodically, the stream would halt its flow. A deafening roar would commence as the immense fields of ice were compressed and thrust upward, sometimes reaching heights of 30 feet, effectively damming the water behind. Consequently, the river rose rapidly, spilling over the low-lying areas and depositing colossal masses of ice upon the shore. Subsequently, the formidable power of the reinforced waters surmounted the towering dam of ice, propelling it downstream with a resounding crash reminiscent of shattering glass. At the bends in the river and around the massive boulders, a terrifying chaos unfolded. Colossal blocks of ice jammed and violently jostled one another until some were launched entirely into the air, colliding with those already suspended, or were hurled against the curving cliffs and embankments, violently tearing out boulders, earth, and trees high upon the slopes. All along the low embankments, this titan of nature, with a suddenness that renders man a mere pygmy in force, thrust upward a formidable wall of ice, 15 to 20 feet high, which the peasants call Zaborega, and through which they cannot reach the river without physically hewing a path. I witnessed this giant perform one particularly incredible feat. A block many feet thick and several yards square was hurled through the air, descending to crush saplings and small trees more than 100 feet from the bank. Observing this majestic withdrawal of the ice, I was overwhelmed by terror and revulsion upon beholding the grisly spoils that the Yenisei bore away during this annual retreat. These were the bodies of the executed counter-revolutionaries, officers, soldiers, and Cossacks of the former army of the superior governor of all anti-Bolshevik Russia, Admiral Kolchak. They were the gruesome manifestations of the Chaikas' bloody work at Minyasinsk. Hundreds of these bodies, bereft of heads and hands, with mutilated faces, half-burned torsos, and fractured skulls, floated and intermingled with the blocks of ice, seemingly searching for their graves. Alternatively, caught in the furious whirlpools among the jagged flows, they were ground and torn asunder into shapeless masses, which the river, as though nauseated by its grim task, vomited upon the islands and projecting sandbars. I traversed the entire length of the Middle Yenisei, constantly encountering these putrefying and terrifying reminders of the Bolsheviks' atrocities. At one juncture, alongside a bend in the river, I observed a massive heap of equine carcasses cast ashore by the ice and the current, numbering no fewer than 300. A verst downstream, I was sickened beyond endurance upon discovering a grove of willows along the embankment, which had raked the polluted stream, catching and cradling in their finger-like, drooping branches human bodies in myriad shapes and attitudes. They possessed a macabre semblance of naturalness that seared an everlasting image into my distraught mind. Of this pitiful, gruesome company, I counted 70. At long last, the mountain of ice passed by, succeeded by muddy freshets that bore downstream the trunks of fallen trees, scattered logs, and bodies. The fisherman and his son loaded me and my luggage into their dugout canoe, fashioned from a single aspen tree, and poled upstream along the bank. Poling against a swift current is exceedingly arduous labor. At the sharp curves, we were compelled to row, valiantly struggling against the stream's formidable force. In certain places, we even had to hug the cliffs, making headway solely by clutching the rocky outcroppings with our bare hands and dragging the vessel forward at a painstaking pace. Occasionally, it required a considerable span of time merely to advance 5 or 6 meters through these treacherous rapids. In 2 days' time, we attained the objective of our journey. I spent several days at this abandoned gold mine, where the watchman and his family resided. As they were critically short of provisions, they had nothing to spare for me. Consequently, my rifle once again served to sustain me, while simultaneously contributing a modicum of sustenance to my hosts. One day, a trained agriculturalist arrived at our encampment. I made no effort to conceal myself, for during my winter sojourn in the woods, I had grown such a heavy beard that, in all likelihood, my own mother would have failed to recognize me. However, our guest was exceedingly shrewd and immediately divined my true identity. I harbored no fear of him, as I perceived he was not a Bolshevik, an assessment I later found confirmed. We discovered mutual acquaintances and shared a corresponding viewpoint regarding current events. He resided near the gold mine in a modest village, where he superintended various public works. We resolved to flee from Russia together. For a prolonged period, I had puzzled over this matter, and now my plan was fully formulated. Possessing a thorough understanding of the geography and prevailing circumstances in Siberia, I determined that our most promising route to safety lay through Urianhai, the northern expanse of Mongolia situated at the headwaters of the Yenisei River, and subsequently across Mongolia toward the Far East and the Pacific Ocean. Prior to the collapse of the Kolchak government, I had been commissioned to survey Urianhai and western Mongolia. Consequently, I had meticulously studied all available maps and literature pertaining to the region. The execution of this audacious stratagem was powerfully driven by the profound incentive of my own preservation. Chapter 7. Through Soviet Siberia. Following a delay of several days, We commenced our journey southward through the forests along the left bank of the Yenisei, deliberately circumventing settlements to avoid leaving any discernible trail that might invite pursuit. On the rare occasions when necessity compelled us to enter a village. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.